Reports suggest US is ready to loosen restrictions on Ukraine for the use of long-range weapons to target deep inside Russia. But the Biden administration says no decision has been made in this regard yet. While Ukraine has been asking for these permissions since long, calls for using long-range weapons have increased ever since Ukraine's Kursk invasion. Now, Russia and Russian reports suggest that Ukraine has lost over 12,200 personnel since its Kursk invasion. Is Ukraine more desperate now than ever before for using long-range weapons? If it does get that permission, what difference will it make? To discuss matters further with me on this episode of Game Plan, I'm being joined by Ben Aris, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews and former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Ben, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining me on Game Plan. Do you feel it'll make a difference in the ongoing war if Ukraine gets permission to use long-range weapons and target deep inside Russia?
Yes, of course it will. One of the really bizarre things about this war that you should appreciate at the beginning is that Russia is on the border with Ukraine. And so it can bring all its weapons, rockets, drones right up to the border with Ukraine and fly them and hit any target in Ukraine it likes. They can reach across the whole country. Conversely, Ukraine is not allowed to hit anything inside Russia up to the border. And so it has no way of defending itself or attacking these missiles and jet fighters that are taking off literally across the road and hitting its own targets. And so Zelensky has been desperate for permission to hit targets inside Russia. What we're talking about here, for example, the Russians have introduced these glide bombs, these very heavy Second World War bombs that they strap wings to that are, huge. They have like 1,400 kilograms of high explosive. They've only got a range of about 50 kilometers, maybe 100. And so Russia's been firing these over the border and hitting targets, devastating what little defenses Ukraine has. And Ukraine is unable to respond to that because of a de facto no-fly ban over Russia imposed by the Americans. So what Zelensky wants to do with this permission of taking the powerful bombs, the HIMARS, the ATA CMSs that the Americans have, the Shadow Storms that the the UK and France has, and use them to hit military targets, specifically airfields, logistics centers, ammo dumps, concentrations of troops inside Russia to push them back from the border in order to relieve the pressure on the Ukrainian defenders in Donbass, for example. Because if you push them back, then the glide bombs, for example, become ineffective because you have to come too close to the border, or at least it makes it possible to shoot the jet fighters down that are launching them, and it puts Ukraine back with a fighting chance in the war.
So definitely, it will make a lot of difference because Ukraine also gets an equal hand at attempting the way Russia has been attacking Ukraine, deep inside Ukrainian territory. But at the same time, the West is worried that if it gives it that permission, there is going to be a major escalation because it is anticipated that Russia's retaliation is going to be a rather strong one. I also wanted to just bring in some figures that are coming in from the Russian side. Then Major General Apri Laudinov, who's the commander of the Akhmat Special Forces Commando Unit, he claims that Ukraine has lost at least 7,000 troops in the Sudza district of Kursk alone. How long do you feel Kyiv can sustain in Kursk? It's already been well over a month now, and they're still very much there, at least the ones who are still alive.
Indeed. The problem, well, the numbers, it's impossible to believe anybody's numbers.
Yes.
Both sides numbers up. Nevertheless, obviously, Ukraine is taking casualties, and in the early stages of the invasion, the Kursk incursion, that they were moving very fast. And what's happened now is after a month, Russia hasn't brought troops from Donbass, which was one of the possible reasons for doing this.
And perhaps that is what Kyiv anticipated or hoped, that they may want to pull back, but that did not happen. Please go ahead.
Didn't work.
Yes.
Didn't work. And so Russia's brought up, reportedly from the Ukrainian side, they say that Russia's brought up 30,000 troops. We're not sure how many Ukrainian forces went into Kursk. It's somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000. However, now, after a month, they're slowing down, and these Russian troops, they're not engaging per se. I mean, there are battles, but what they're trying to do, the Russians, is to box them in. I mean, the territory, it's very impressive, but at the end of the day, It's, it's a salient of 40 kilometers long and 35 deep into Kursk. It's tiny. It's really insignificant piece of territory with nothing of value on it. A few villages, 400,000 people in total, most of whom have been evacuated. And now the AFU has slowed down, these bombs come into play. And Zelensky himself was saying the Russians are firing like 20, 30 glide bombs a day against the troops. And as soon as they stop moving, they become vulnerable. So they're going to take casualties. And the problem Ukraine faces is it's already facing an acute manpower shortage.
Yes.
It needs those front line in Donbass, where there's really, brutal battles going on for control over the Donbass, and the Ukrainian defenders are falling back. And yet they've taken their very best equipped, best trained soldiers and sent them into Kursk. And, you could argue they're now sitting ducks and they're just going to be bombed. And this is why Russia's not in a rush. It doesn't need to engage. It just needs to box them in and then pound them with bombs and shells. And they will take casualties. And where do you go? Where does Ukraine go from this? I mean, they're not going to invade all of Russia or get to Moscow, or, all of these things are impossible. So it's politically extremely useful. Militarily, though, lots of people have raised question marks over the logic of it, what military advantage it brings, because it doesn't seem to bring much military advantage at all.
Ben, I'll just take forward from what you just mentioned that, the two things, of course, which are very pertinent here. The fact that Ukraine would have definitely, for an operation like Kursk, they would have sent in their very best. And the reports of Ukraine being outmanned, they've been surfacing since several months now. That's nothing new. So whatever they had, they sent in the best into Russia. Now, that is the belief. And the other thing that you mentioned, that none of these figures can really be believed from either side, because we only have to go by what reports are suggesting. So at this point, the Russian Defense Ministry reported on September 11 that over the period of combat operations in the Kursk area, that is since August 6th, Ukraine has lost over 12,200 personnel. Now, whether or not these figures are accurate or even close to being accurate, well, that is definitely debatable. But does Ukraine's desperate calls for long-range weapons reflect the mounting death toll of on-ground soldiers in Kursk? Because its calls for getting that permission to use long-range weapons, they've really increased in the last 1 month, if you observe.
Zelensky's saying it every day. I mean, they are. It seems, it smacks of desperation. Because, as I said, the AFU, the troops, Ukrainian troops inside Kursk and in the front line as well in Donbass, are constantly being pounded by these Russian munitions. And the use of long-range missiles to take out all of the airfields in the vicinity is militarily very useful. But given that their boys are sitting in the field in Kursk, exposed to these bombs, still, that this for Ukraine is untenable in so much as they're just going to take casualties. And as we said, they're short of men in the first place. So Zelensky really needs this to happen very quickly, because not only will it protect the people in Kursk, the AFU in Kursk, but it will also relieve the pressure on the front line to some extent. And as the front line in Donbass, which is the key battle, that is going very badly, the Ukrainian forces are being pushed back slowly, this relief would be key. And it's reported already that the Russians are anticipating this permission being given, and that they've taken 80% of their fighters, their airborne forces, and moved them back out of range of the ATACMSs, the really powerful American missiles that might play very soon. So, and then given the details of the delay from the White House side is that they're on the verge of giving these permissions, but they're very worried about escalation. And Blinken is due to talk to Zelensky about this, and it's anticipated that they will get this permission, but again, with a whole list of restrictions. Basically, they're going to say, look, you can hit airfields and really, howitzers or troop barracks, but that's it. I mean, you mustn't hit energy, you mustn't hit oil refineries, you mustn't hit civilian targets, you can't use them to hit Moscow, anything like that, because they're afraid of provoking Russia into a retaliation and starting Third World War if Russia then says, look, you are now attacking us Russians inside Russia with NATO missiles. That's an act of war. We're going to war with NATO.
Ben, one more point. Is it safe to say, or is it accurate to say, that the Kursk invasion has been a fiasco for Ukraine?
No, but it's mixed. As I say, politically, it's extremely useful because, I mean, since the failed summer offensive in last summer, the morale has been decaying, the war increasingly looks unwinnable. And so the morale boost from invading Russia and romping through, large swathes of Russian countryside unopposed and taking village after village, town after town, I think the total is now up to around 100, that this has been a huge boost, both for the military and the population. Moreover, it's put the story back on the front page, and that's very important for Ukraine because they are completely dependent on international support. And once again, they look like brave heroes, the David that is defeating Goliath. And that keeps the money coming, that keeps the arms coming. The US has rolled out several new packages of more military aid at a time when it's becoming increasingly reluctant. Congress is increasingly reluctant to sign these checks. So all of that's very useful. But as I pointed out before, militarily, it's very questionable. And the loss of men, particularly their best trained, and also the equipment that's coming. I mean, there are reports HIMARS have been blown up. There's reports 2 batteries of Patriot missiles have been destroyed by the Russians. And this is equipment Ukraine can very ill afford to lose. So militarily, it's very questionable. And I don't know, I mean, at some point, the Ukraine's going to have to call this, if they don't get permission to use long-range missiles and then push the Russian forces further back, then they're going to have to withdraw. And all of this could happen very soon. The rains have just started. The whole territory is going to turn into a sea of mud. And then the snow will come. And then Ukrainian forces in Kursk, they're very long supply lines. And basically it's the same problem that Napoleon faced when he invaded Russia, that you can't supply your army and that the weather, general weather, is going to come and get you. And that's a very formidable enemy.
The weather is going to turn hostile, and it's going to happen in in a matter of within a month. I think after that the winters are going to be setting in, and that has been a problem not from now, not since World War II, but even since years and years and years before that. Anytime there's been a war over there, that's been a standard problem. So that is something definitely which also makes the clock tick backwards for Ukraine to get those, to get permission to use those weapons inside Russia. Of course, lots more. The war is far from over. We will be tracking this closely. Thank you, Ben, for joining me right here on Game Plan. That was Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews and former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure's mine.